Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Miller, and welcome to the first lecture in this series on Jain studies. This lecture will pretty carefully follow Paul Dundas's book, The Jains, pages 1 through 21. As we'll see, the Jain tradition is a vibrant tradition. There are many stereotypes, however, that were brought onto this tradition early on that we're also going to deconstruct in this lecture that portrayed it as a very colorless and austere tradition. I want to begin, though, by showing you a quick video that we'll refer back to make this point later in the lecture.
गीता जैन महिला मंडल बेंगलोर द्वारा चरम तीर्थंकर प्रभु महावीर स्वामी का जन्म कल्याणक महोत्सव मनाया गया।
कृष्णा मैया ने जायो लाल बधाई सारी नगरी में। कृष्णा मैया ने जायो लाल बधाई सारी नगरी में। कृष्णा मैया ने जायो लाल बधाई सारी नगरी में। कृष्णा मैया ने जायो लाल बधाई सारी नगरी में। जय हो।
Okay, keep some of those images in mind as we move forward in this first lecture. The topics that we'll cover are following Dundas pretty closely. We'll look at what some early Western views of Jains were. We'll also look at some of the early views even before the Western views, as you'll see. We'll look at the Jain population. We'll look at Jain identity. What does it mean to call yourself a Jain? We'll look at the Vedic setting in which Jainism emerged. We'll also look at the Jain notion of the internalization of the sacrifice, as well as the founders of Jainism and Jain conceptions of time. It's a lot of moving pieces that we're going to kind of put together here in this first lecture as a ground to move forward, but we'll lay out several important things worth noting as we move along. I'll begin here as Dundas did with the story of VIRUPAKA the Ugly. VIRUPAKA the Ugly is a story that comes out of a text, a Hindu text, as Dundas points out, known as the Deeds of the Ten Princes by an author named Dundan in the 7th century of the Common Era. This Hindu text is important because it portrays Jains in a particular way that is historically significant, both within South Asia as well as beyond when we see some of the Western views that will emerge afterwards in its wake. According to the story in this book, there's a monk, a Jain monk, named VIRUPAKA, who, according to the story in Dundan's Deeds of the Ten Princes, was robbed essentially by a wealthy prostitute who took everything that he owned. So he was involved with some sort of prostitute. She was very wealthy and smart, and she ended up taking all of his money. Because of this, and out of total desperation, VIRUPAKA converted to Jainism. He converted to Jainism from Hinduism. Okay, so having lost everything with nowhere to go, he could only go to Jainism, according to the story. Filthy and restricted, as Dundas points out, he still regrets leaving the Hindu tradition. He feels like he left behind so much by becoming a Jain, but that he actually deserved it because he let the prostitute take all of his wealth. And he knows and he regrets that eventually he's going to go to hell for everything that he's done, and he's just going to have to live out his life as a Jain ascetic because there's nowhere else for him to go. The moral that this story attempts to convey, as Dundas points out, this Hindu story, is that Jains are naked and filthy ascetics, that they're not living lives worth living, that they're sort of a last chance, last option within this Vedic world setting, as we'll see in ancient India. But as we'll see, this was a very, very, very rhetorical claim on the part of the Hindus, trying to portray what was actually a very vibrant an important religious tradition that we're going to look at as we move forward in this lecture series. So this was a stereotype. And as we'll see, Jain life and Jain Dharma and the Jain tradition are very, 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 very vibrant and very different from the way that the story has portrayed this Jain in this particular instance. Now, following from some of those early South Asian views of Jains, and there were others, of course, Buddhists also portrayed Jains in ways that were not so nice. And that's what you do when you have competitors in the religious world, right? So they were not nice to each other. Now, there were also Western views of Jains that emerged during the colonial period that really came as a result of reading a lot of these texts written by Hindus as well as Jains themselves. So as Dundas points out, and you see in bullet point number 1 here, the morbidity of Jain texts confused Indologists. So Indologists being those people who started to study India during the colonial period and afterwards. They would read Jain texts and they would see these portrayals of Jain ascetics, the monks and nuns, doing all sorts of austerities to themselves, fasting, walking around naked, not bathing, and so on and so forth. And it really painted a really nasty picture for them of what they thought the Jain tradition was. Now, again, of course, we're going to see that these become stereotypes that are inappropriate to apply when we look at Jainism and the Jain tradition in its totality. One particular instance that Dundas points out how this stereotype emerges in popular Western view is in a book by Mrs. Sinclair Stevenson known as The Heart of Jainism, as you see in bullet point number 2. In this book, as Miss Sinclair Stevenson says, Jainism is heartless. Even though the title of the book is The Heart of Jainism, as you see to the right here in the image, she says that Jainism is heartless, and she's basing her opinion off of these early stereotypes. And of course, being from the Christian tradition, she says Jesus is much better than Jainism and the founders of Jainism. So again, as in bullet point number 3 points out, this is a stereotype, or these are stereotypes that were made early on, both in South Asia, as well as by Westerners, that portray Jains as filthy, colorless, austere, and exotic, as Dundas points out. They are just not worth interacting with, and it's definitely not a religious tradition that you want to be a part of. Again, these are stereotypes, and as we know with stereotypes, they're wrong, right? And this is what Dundas points out. As you see in bullet point number 4, the stereotypes are actually inadequate. They focus only on the ascetic life and the early ascetic life, the monks and nuns, those who left society. And it disregards 2 things. One, Jainism's rich philosophy that emerges, as well as you see in the last bullet point, the existence of a very large and prosperous lay community, okay, householders, people like you and me, who are concerned not with walking around and performing austerities per se, but we're more concerned with prosperity and living a moral life in a day-to-day householder life, family life, business life, just like you and I, as I mentioned. It was this lay community that was later discovered, and of course still exists to this day, that supported the ascetic community. Because as we'll also see, what are being portrayed as nasty practices by both Hindu texts as well as early Western views in Indology, and Miss Sinclair Stevenson herself, are stereotypes of Jains that don't take into account their pursuit of liberation. So the practices that are being undertaken by these Jain ascetics who seem nasty and filthy and so on are actually a commitment to a life of perfecting nonviolence. And when you look at it through that prism, you soon realize that what the monks and nuns are doing, the hard things that they're doing to their body, are being done for the ultimate spiritual pursuit of liberation. So we're going to consider all of this as we move through, and we're going to get beyond these stereotypes. Okay, so now let's look at Jain population briefly. As Dundas points out, the Jain population is mostly in India, okay, and you can see the map on the right here of India, heavily concentrated in the following 5 areas, the following 5 states within India, which you see the little blotches in green on the map are highlighting. So number 1, Maharashtra, number 2, Rajasthan, number 3, Gujarat, number 4, Madhya Pradesh, and number 5, Karnataka, all the way down in South India. This is where most Jains will be found. And one of the most recent statistics that I've seen from SOAS is that there are approximately 5 to 7 million Jains globally, right? So it's a small population. And so we have to consider that the Jain tradition is very, very small, but at the same time, very, very powerful and wealthy because of their professionalism, their connection to profession and industry that goes back thousands of years. Okay, so the Jains are small but prosperous and also very philanthropic community. In fact, it's because of the Jain community that you are getting this lecture series. They have endowed me in this position to do this for you, as well as a number of other professors and endowed chairs all over North America. They're very prosperous and very generous. Okay, so in addition to the 5 to 7 million Jains globally, about 100,000 of them, probably more now, are in the US, and 25,000, probably more now, in the UK, because this book that we're reading is from about 2002. So the Jains are small, thriving, prosperous, and philanthropic, spread throughout the world, but mainly centered in South Asia. Okay, so what does it mean to be a Jain? How is a Jain different from a Buddhist or a Hindu? Well, Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism are the three major religious traditions of South Asia or India. There are more, of course, but these are the three main ones that we tend to refer to as the Dharma traditions. What does it mean to be a Jain? Well, it's confusing. And here we have to actually deconstruct and unpack the very word Jainism, or sometimes referred to properly, pronounced Jainism. Because when you start to use the word ism, you have to realize that any ism is a Western construct in and of itself. So our own need to identify who a Jain is and who a Jain is not goes all the way back to the colonial period, when the British, who had colonized India to extract its resources, began to try to figure out how they could manage the religious populations according to their own religious law. In doing so, they identified the Hindus, which was the predominant tradition or set of traditions within South Asia and within India at the time, and it still is. But they saw this other group who worked closely with the Hindus, and in some ways were very similar, but also very different. And these were the Jains. And at times, the British would lump the Hindus and the Jains together because they couldn't figure out who was who. And we'll see what the distinctions are as we move forward in this lecture series. But the important thing to note now is that in 1947, Jains became subject to Hindu law because the British simply had a difficult time piecing out who was who, because they worked so closely within the merchant caste. This, of course, as I'm pointing out, is all a colonial project. The British want to rule the Indian population for the purpose of extracting resources, for the purpose of serving the imperial interests of Britain, right? So the need to call something an ism is the need to identify someone so that you can rule them. It's a need to try to put a label on them so that you can rule them in a particular way according to their religious law. We can see how this is problematic, how it's colonial, and how it leads to a whole host of issues. And so I'm going to go ahead and say right now that the word Jainism with the ism is sort of a bad word. And I want you to excuse me as I move through this lecture series and at times use it as a matter of convenience. But always keep in mind that the word Jainism, to identify those who belong to the Jain tradition, is a colonial construct. And why is that important? Well, as a Western category, it does not acknowledge a few things about the Jain tradition. One, that it doesn't see itself as an ism, but as a Dharma tradition, a tradition that seeks to help people fulfill and live Dharma, according to the teachings of Jainism, to live a virtuous and good and moral life according to the teachings of Jainism and the way that the Jain tradition sees reality. Okay, so Jainism, in a way, it occludes or doesn't allow us to see that aspect of Jain life. The other thing that Jainism, this Western category, does not acknowledge is the fluidity of religious traditions in South Asia. So while in the West, we can very easily say, I am Christian, I am Jewish, I am Muslim, for example, in the Abrahamic traditions, there's a lot more fluidity between traditions in India and South Asia that Western categories don't allow. So if we label something as an ism and put borders around it, we pretend like it's not interacting and actually crossing over in many ways with other traditions. For example, Jainism and Hinduism are very much interlinked in ways, as we'll see as we move forward, that calling them an ism and trying to put them in a box is inaccurate to do that, Okay, so for example, one example Dundas gives is it is not uncommon for a Jain somehow to worship a Hindu deity, not as an ultimate god per se, but for the removal, for example, of obstacles in one's life. So it wouldn't be unheard of for a Jain to give some sort of worship or praise at some point to Ganesha, the remover of obstacles in Hinduism, or another god or goddess for a particular reason. So we can see there's a shared devotional circle, but there are also things about Jains that make them unique, and we're also going to look at those, right? There is, as this last bullet point points out, and Dundas says, there is a Jain mode of life that we can identify and we should identify, but we have to be careful about the language that we use to describe it because we don't want to be colonial. So again, forgive me as we move forward. I will slip, I will say Jainism or Jainism, but I'm really referring to this Jain tradition that is both fluid and distinct as a mode of life and a way of living life and a way of living Jain Dharma. So continuing with this idea of Jain identity, what are those distinct aspects of Jain identity that we can identify? Well, Jains, okay, were originally called Niganta or Nirgranta or Nirgranti. These are Prakrit and Sanskrit words that mean free from bonds. So a Jain is someone who is free from bonds to the world, bonds to family, bonds to society. They've actually left the world to achieve liberation. So a Jain is someone who is able in practice to give up all the attachments of life to achieve liberation. The person or the people who have done that and have been the great exemplars for Jains are known as the Jinnas, as you see in bullet point number 2. A Jinna comes from the verbal root ji in Sanskrit, which means the conqueror, someone who has conquered. And as we'll see, the Jain conquerors, the Jinnas, come out of India's warrior caste, as the Buddha did as well. So they're called conquerors, but they're not conquerors of something external. What's important here is that they're conquerors of themselves. They're conquerors of their own attachments, their own emotional attachments, their own physical attachments, all of their issues, all of the human issues, the human aspects of the human condition, greed, lust, so on and so forth. They have conquered all of those things. That is why they are referred to as Jinnas. So a Jain or a Jaina or a Jain is someone who adheres to and gives great devotion to the Jinnas. And there are 24 of these Jinnas, one of which you see pictured here to the right, and we'll look at them in a future lecture. The other thing that a Jain does that solidifies their identity as unique is that they give authority to and they act according to the 3 jewels, as you see in the 3rd bullet point here. These 3 jewels are right faith, right knowledge, and right conduct. And so you can see in the image to the right that those 3 jewels form the foundation of the Jain tradition. And so what does that mean? So there's a lot of interpretations of what this means, but one way to think about it is that right faith comes from the word darshana, and darshana means to see. So you have the right darshana, you have the right vision. You see the world according to Jain philosophy. You see it according to the way that the Jinnas and the philosophers say that reality is constructed. And we'll look at that, how reality is constructed, and we move forward in another lecture about Jain philosophy. But it's a fundamental commitment to say, hey, what they say about the structure of reality and how to escape from it through liberation, that is true. I buy into that. I have faith in that vision, in that reality. Number 2, right knowledge. Right knowledge is not just knowledge of learning things. It certainly involves that. But for a Jain, a commitment to right knowledge is a commitment to discovering the knowledge of the fundamental freedom of one's higher self or soul. Okay? In order to do that, one has to first have that right faith, right? They have to develop that knowledge through study and spiritual practice, most importantly, which brings us to number 3, right conduct. For a Jain, one must act according to the structure of reality as adhered to in number 1, right? As well as the idea that the soul is itself something that's trapped in, worth being liberated through knowledge. And number two, one has to act appropriately to achieve that knowledge and to be right in the world and right with the world. So these three jewels are fundamental and unique to Jainism, or the Jain tradition, and we should always keep them in mind. These are things that make Jains Jains, makes them distinct and unique. So where do the Jains come from in India? They come from North India initially. They'll spread, as we'll see in future lectures. But they happen to grow up alongside what is known as the Vedic culture, or the Aryan culture. As you see in bullet point number 1, from about 1500 to 1000 BCE, an Aryan culture emerges in northwest India. These Aryans are the quote-unquote noble people. Arya means noble. And they are a group of people who will eventually become the roots of the Hindu tradition. They perform what is known as the Vedic sacrifice. The Vedic sacrifice is grounded in texts known as the Vedas. These are Hindu ancient texts that prescribe ways for undertaking ritual sacrifice properly. And it is through this ritual sacrifice that these Aryans pour substances into a fire, offering them up to the gods in order to get things in return. Okay, so we've heard of sacrifice before. The Aryans are masters of sacrifice. They make offerings into a fire, those offerings are carried up, and the gods return favors such as wealth, prosperity, health, sons, because everybody wants to have a son in ancient India, right? You have to have a son within Vedic culture to repay your debts to your ancestors. So there is this Aryan sacrificial culture of giving to get something back all the time. It's a very materialistic culture, if you want to think about it that way, in the sense that it's always asking for things for the gods through the sacrifice, in addition to other things, but that's one of the main things that's happening with the sacrifice. And at the same time, alongside the Aryans, from about 1000 to 500 BCE, there is the emergence of the Jain as well as the Buddhist tradition in what is referred to sometimes as this impure East India. So just to the east of where the Aryans are emerging, there's this impure East where the Buddhist and the Jain traditions will emerge in what is known as the Gangetic Basin. So within this Eastern impure culture, the Jains and the Buddhists emerge, but realize that the label of impurity is being applied by the Vedas, or the Vedics, the Brahmin priests within the Vedic tradition who claim to have the ultimate purity, right? So they grow up alongside each other during this, what is known as the second urbanization in India, as you see in bullet point number 2, where there are a lot of cities emerging in North India, right at the confluence of these two cultures. At the same time, there are people within Aryan culture who begin to question the meaning of the sacrifice, right? Because if you continually pour things into a fire and get things back, and pour things into a fire and get things back, right? The wealth and so on and so forth, there has to be something more to life than that. So these people who are in the Vedic culture who are making these sacrifices begin to reflect on what it is that they're doing. What is the ultimate purpose of this sacrifice, right? So within the Vedic culture itself, there's a questioning of Vedic sacrificial culture and the meaning of life. And then next door in the Gangetic Basin, amongst the Buddhists and most specifically the Jains, there is the emergence of what is known as an ascetic culture. People who are also questioning the continual need to live a materialistic lifestyle, especially as cities are emerging. People are getting condensed and getting closer to one another, getting sick, feeling alienated, feeling more individualistic in these cities. There's an emergence within the Gangetic Basin alongside the Vedic culture that also is questioning society, right? And what the reality is that the people questioning society in the Vedic society and the people questioning society in the Gangetic Basin are overlapping in ways, and they're actually part of this greater ascetic culture of people who are now starting to renounce that way of life, the materialistic way of life, in favor of living some kind of spiritual life. There's evidence for this greater shared culture in a book that Dundas points out known as the Sayings of the Seers, which emerged, as you see in the last bullet point here, sometime around the 2nd century BCE, so after these cultures have been growing up by one another for a while. And what's important about this text is it lists the following ascetics or spiritual leaders on equal ground. Okay, so Mahavira, Parshvanath, the Buddhist disciples, and Yajnavalkya. Why is that important? Well, Mahavira is the founder of contemporary Jainism, as we'll see. Parshvanat was part of the Jain tradition and came right before him. The Buddha's disciples, of course, belonged to Buddhism, and Yajnavalkya was a great Hindu theologian. So essentially what this book is showing is that all of these ascetics were on equal ground, essentially showing that even though there was a distinct Jain tradition, these people were all working together. Even though they had doctrinal differences and disputes, they were practicing together. They were renouncing the world together. They were out in the forests and the jungles together, trying to get beyond this world of suffering, of constant asking for more and more and more, of materialism and so on and so forth. So this is the setting in which Jainism emerges, or the Jain tradition emerges, the setting of material wealth and a desire to get beyond just the wealth and the prosperity and the world and the materialism into some form of infinite lasting freedom. Why does that happen? Well, within this Vedic setting, there are two speculations or two ideas that emerge from speculation of the sacrifice. So again, if the sacrifice is being performed on a regular basis to get things, these two ideas emerge as people begin to speculate on its purpose. Number one is samsara. Samsara refers to the constant process of death and rebirth, the transmigration of the soul from one birth, one life to the next. Because people have desire when they die, because they keep making sacrifices to keep having a good life and then they die, much as most of us do during our lives even today. Because of this, because people retain that desire and that karma, they will be reborn into a new body, and they'll have to go through the cycle endlessly of death and rebirth and suffering over and over and over again, right? The sacrifice, because it's asking for things over and over and over again, and it involves attachment to the material world, is itself something that keeps people locked into this system of transmigration, of death and rebirth, of reincarnation, of samsara. So then a need to get out of it emerges, or a desire to get out of it emerges. And this is where the concept of karma is also important, because karma can mean a lot of things, but originally referred to the performance of the ritual, okay, the ritual action. This performance of the ritual would cause you to be born over and over and over again. Again, partially because you're asking for things over and over and over again, and you're accruing karma as a result, right? You're wanting more, and therefore you're going to come back. Your soul is going to come back, or your subtle body is going to come back for more into the world. And you might even be reborn, not as a human, but as an animal or something even lesser than that, right? So because of these two ideas of samsara and karma, there is a need that emerges for people to experience something even greater and everlasting. That is moksha. That is liberation, as you see here at the end of the bullet point. How do you achieve moksha? Precisely by taking that sacrifice that you're performing outside to get things for yourself, right? Through all your human greed to get the things you want. Precisely by internalizing that sacrifice within your own body through yoga and ascetic practice. And it is the Jains who helped develop this idea, and it is the Jains who are definitely on board with it. To the right here in this image, you see pictures of Jain nuns who are trying to achieve liberation, right? And we'll talk a lot more about them later, but they're wearing face masks so that they won't harm any microorganisms, for example, and we'll see why that is. They're trying to perfect nonviolence, and for the Jains, it is the perfection of nonviolence, which is part of the internalization of the sacrifice that allows one to be liberated. So let's look at how the Jain internalization of the sacrifice is understood within the Jain tradition. We can look at this through the story of Harikesha that Dundas tells in his book. Harikesha is someone who has become a Jain. He is walking along, and Jain ascetics, of course, monks and nuns, have to beg for their food, right? And he goes and he asks some Brahmins, so some Hindu Vedic priests of the highest order, who are performing a sacrifice, right? So they're keeping themselves in that perpetual cycle of reincarnation, right? But he asks them for some alms, just for some food, something he can eat to keep him going on his spiritual pursuit. Instead of helping him, however, they attack him. Because remember, the Vedic culture did not like the Jains, right? They were filthy and so on, according to them. They attack him. He's asking for food and they attack him. That would be like a homeless person asking for food and you attack them, right? That's pretty messed up. What happens, however, is that a tree spirit, as you see here to the right in this image, this is one of the tree spirits, a Yakshi comes and saves him from the Brahmin attack because it acknowledges and recognizes his purity as a Jain ascetic. After being rescued, the Brahmins now have his attention, or he has the Brahmins' attention, the priest's attention. And he tells the priests, he tells the Brahmins, I will tell you the true nature of the sacrifice. You think that you're performing the sacrifice correctly. You think you're doing it right. You think you're living the right life through this Vedic sacrificial culture. But let me tell you how the sacrifice really works. And this is where the internalization of that sacrifice becomes important within one's own body. He says to the Brahmin priests, my austerities, so all of his spiritual practices of fasting, wandering naked, not wearing clothing, and not having any possessions, for example, not having sex, all the ways that he's depriving his body of its human desires and needs. His austerities are the sacrificial fire that is lit in his life, right? So the sacrificial fire is within him, and it happens because he gives all these things up and it causes a fire to burn inside of him. In Sanskrit, we refer to this as tapas, which comes from the verbal root tap, which means to heat something up. So you're heating yourself up. You're not performing a sacrifice outside of yourself. You're performing a sacrifice within yourself, and you're doing it by giving up all the things that humans normally want. That causes a lot of fire inside. He says then, number 2, my mental and my physical effort are the ladle for pouring the oblation into the fire. So in a Vedic sacrifice, various substances would be poured into the fire and offered up to the gods, right? And they would get something in return. The humans would get something in return. Well, according to Harikesha, his mental and physical effort are the ladles for pouring the oblation into the fire inside of him, right? Because it takes a lot of mental control and physical effort and endurance to perform austerities, to give things up that the human body normally craves. Number 3, he says, my body is the dung fuel for the fire. Okay, so a sacrificial fire would probably be lit with some cow dung because it burns really well, at least to get it started. And that dung, the body itself within the Jain tradition is that dung fuel for the fire. So his body is now the fuel for the fire, and his actions are the firewood that will keep that fire going. So this is all going on inside of his body. And this is really important, as Dundas points out, because what Harikesha is essentially saying to these Brahmin priests is that my purity is earned through the internalization of the sacrifice. I am purifying myself with this internal fire. Your purity, Brahmin priest born into the Vedic culture with the caste system, was given to you by your birth. You didn't have to earn it. My purity, however, is earned. And purity is therefore not given by birth, and therefore what you are doing, being born into the Brahmin caste and thinking that you are pure, is really ultimately not true. You must internalize the sacrifice and purify yourself. And this is really the Jain pursuit of austerity and of the internalization of the sacrifice, which will ultimately lead to liberation. So as we already pointed out, the Brahmin ritual, so the priestly ritual, the Vedic Hindu ritual of sacrifice, as well as just action in general, doing things in life, creates karma, right, within us, because we have desire to do things and we're causing things to happen. Therefore, what goes around comes around. And it causes us to be perpetually reborn in the cycle of samsara, death and rebirth. Therefore, it becomes necessary, first and foremost, to stop karma. And we'll see that karma is a very important concept within not only the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, but in the Jain tradition, it's a very important concept. You have to get rid of all your karma. You have to burn all your karma in order to be liberated, right? Through internalization of the sacrifice. But how do you do that? How do you burn all your karma? Well, we saw how the internalization of the sacrifice is being imagined by Harikesha and explained to the Brahmins. But really what it boils down to is what is known as the Shramana ideal, as you see in bullet point number 3. Shram comes from the verb root, or Shramana comes from the verb root shram in Sanskrit, which means to strive after something, to strive after a goal. Here we're striving after liberation through our own physical efforts. How do we do that? We minimize external action. So not only do we not perform the sacrifice anymore, we try not to do anything at all, including even think or even control mental action. For example, as you see to the right, this one image of one of the Jain Tirthankaras that we will talk about later, but one of the great leaders of the Jain tradition, he's standing still, upright in a position with his eyes closed. And the Jains and these Jain ascetics would do this for a very long period of time. So they're minimizing their external action and they're controlling their mental action, right? Because that will cause a lot of emotions to come up. And what happens is that a fire ignites within oneself that purifies one, right? You're striving after not something in this world, but you're going inward and upward towards something beyond this world. And for the Jains, that would be to release their soul from their body. So this is the Shramana ideal. Now, the Shramana ideal is carried forward by groups known as Gana, as you see in the 4th bullet point here, or Sangha traditions. We've probably heard Sangha before. It's still used in common speak today in Buddhist and Jain and Hindu traditions. You know, you belong to a Sangha, it means you belong to a community. But originally these words referred to troops within the Aryan tradition. Troops of either soldiers or people who would wander around together. And eventually it becomes appropriated by the ascetics to refer to troops of ascetics, communities of ascetics, renouncers who follow the Shramana ideal together, not to fight something outside of themselves, but to ultimately conquer their own self, right? And as I've mentioned before, Jainism, as you see in the last bullet point, uses martial imagery because their founder was a warrior from the warrior caste. Now, the founders in Jainism are known as the FORDMAKERS, and they're also known as the Jinas or the Tirthankaras. And we're going to have a future lecture where we talk about the meaning of all that, but just keep in mind that a FORDMAKER is someone who builds a bridge from one world to the next. Okay, so the FORDMAKERs or the Tirthankaras were those who built a bridge from this world of suffering to another world of transcendence where suffering no longer existed. Mahavira was the latest of these 24 teachers. We'll talk about him a lot in detail, but I'm just going to give you a brief intro to who he was and how he represented really the paradigm of all of these 24 teachers, because all of these 24 teachers were, like Mahavira, born into the warrior caste, at some time awakened by the gods to their spiritual nature, right? So they're told, number 3, of their destiny to be a spiritual leader. They therefore eventually renounce the world to wander around and perform austerities and give things up. And they do this for an obligatory period of time, right? Because they have to burn all of their karma away in order to be enlightened before they can come back and teach the world about enlightenment and spirituality. Right? And then eventually at the end of their life, they die in meditation, and actually they go and free their soul from their body almost willingly. Okay. And in doing so, because they have no more karma left, they go to the top of the universe where they abide forever and ever and remain, as you see in the 24 pictured here to the right, images and mentors, in a sense, for us to try to emulate, to try to follow their path of austerity and to freedom. So Mahavira, the most recent of the FORDMAKERS, may have been born in 599 and lived until 527 BCE. So this is a really long time ago. New literature suggests, as Dundas points out, or not so new, but that Mahavira may have been a contemporary, and probably was a contemporary of the Buddha. So that would put him more in the 5th century rather than the 6th century. He was born, nevertheless, as a hell being at one point because of karma in a prior life. And after he served his karma as a hell being, he was then born as a lion And as a lion, he realized that he had to cause violence to kill things to survive. And when he realized this as a lion, believe it or not, he overcame his lion animal nature and he starved himself to death. And in doing so, he was then reborn as a god, okay? But it's not as a god that a human, or not as a god that a soul can be liberated forever. It has to be born as a human. And that's exactly what happens. After he's a god and he lives a nice godly life for a little while, he's born as Vardhamana to Trishala, his mother Trishala. His name Vardhamana comes from the fact that it means to expand. And what happened is when he was born into his family in the warrior caste, their wealth expanded exponentially. So that's where his name Vardhamana comes from, but it will change eventually to Mahavira, which means the great hero, obviously the great spiritual hero who conquered himself. Now Mahavira, like all good people in the warrior caste, did get married to Yashoda, and he even had a daughter. But on his 30th birthday, the gods came to remind him and initiate him into spiritual life, and he eventually becomes an ascetic. He wanders the Gangetic plain for 12 and a half years, where he's attacked. He endures a lot of austerities, bug bites, the elements, people not being nice to him, right? But he doesn't fight back because he's trying to perfect nonviolence. And one day, he is enlightened. And that is a very short way of telling the story. And in a future lecture, we're going to tell it in more detail. But I just want you to know the basic stream that these ascetics go through and then eventually achieve enlightenment. Because what happens after that is they end up converting other people into their spiritual order, right? So what Mahavira does then is he goes one by one and he converts 11 Brahmins, so people from Vedic culture performing sacrifices. He converts them into his tradition, which will become Jainism, as leaders of his troop, okay, the Ganadhara. Ganadhara means the holders of the troop, right? They're the ones who are going to hold his teachings and pass them on after he goes, and that's exactly what they do. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to the FORDMAKERS, a very brief introduction to all the different ways that Jains have been viewed and how they're incorrect. It's a very brief introduction to the ideas around which Jainism emerged with Hinduism, Buddhism, and the sacrifice. And I'm just going to finish here on this last slide by pointing out the Jain universal history, the Jain conception of time. And this is something Dundas discusses, and I've created this graph here, or this image here, to try to help you see how it works. So the Jain tradition, like Hinduism and Buddhism, views time as cyclical. Everything has always existed, it always will, and it will never go away. We are not moving from one point to another. Everything is just moving in a constant cycle that repeats itself over and over and over again, forever and ever and ever. The goal, of course, is to get out of this so you don't have to be reborn into it anymore, to liberate your soul from this, right? Otherwise, you're going to be living lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, going through a lot of suffering. Now, the way this Jain time cycle works in the universal history is that it begins with a golden age. So if you start at number 1 at the top of this image here, it begins with a golden age where everyone's doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. The world is perfect. Everyone's living a great life. Everyone's being nice to each other. No one's harming anyone. Nobody's being violent to anyone. Everyone has everything they need and everything's great. However, there is what's known as the Avasarpani, which you see in the top of this slide, the Avasarpani, or the quote unquote down slither. Ava means down, and sarp, the Sanskrit root, means to slither or to slide. So, and actually the word sarpa, snake, comes from the same root, right? So it's a down slither, like a snake, it's slithering down. And what happens is, slowly but surely, over very vast periods of time, the Jain time, the world begins to go into a period of decay through Jain time. And even though things used to be really good, they slowly but surely get worse and worse and worse and worse. And we'll see it eventually leads up to the time that we are in right now. Okay, so stages 1 through 3 are really not that bad, right? Everyone can get whatever they need from a wishing tree, a wish fulfilling tree. Everyone's being pretty good to each other, but it's at this third stage that things start to really go downhill. And it's at this third stage then that the Tirthankaras are born into the world to help humanity, to remind humanity of its spiritual nature, and to help save them from the suffering of the world that is going to ensue. And it's precisely at stage 3 that the first of the 24 Tirthankaras, or leaders of Jainism, is born. And this is Urshaba, whose name you see here by number 3. Urshaba is a very large Tirthankara. He's a giant, okay, so he's very big. And as time goes on and the other Tirthankaras are born in stages 3 through 6, they get smaller and smaller and smaller, and their lifespans get shorter and shorter and shorter. So at the beginning, they live a really long time, and then eventually their lives get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, and they get smaller and smaller until it gets to number 5, stage 5, right? And it is at stage 5 where we see Mahavira come in to give the last teachings, right? But then after that, no more Tirthankaras will be born. What's important is that at stage 5, the Dusama stage, as you see here, the uneven age, life is really awful. People are really being not nice to each other, being really violent with each other. There's no more dharma, there's no more morality, or morality is really in decay, and eventually it's going to die out, right? It's also referred to sometimes as the Kali Yuga. You may have heard this before, the Kali Yuga, when you were studying Hinduism, for example. It's a stage of darkness. Things are going really bad at this time. And this is not a time that you want to be born in the world, but all these souls will be, right? And eventually what happens as things get worse and worse is the Jain doctrine will actually die out at stage 6, as you see here. And then it's like, oh no, everything's terrible and everything's turned to ash and it's all awful. But as I said, it's a cyclical time and everything will come back. So what eventually happens is there's an Utsarpani, as you see to the left. So an upslither of time. And during this upslither of time, things get progressively better and better and better and better and better and better until you get up to stage 1 where everything's perfect. And then slowly everything goes into downslither again. So this is a never-ending perpetual cycle that will go on and on and on and on and on forever. And it's our job as people who are either following the Jain tradition or members of the Jain tradition to follow the teachings and lives of the Tirthankaras, the great FORDMAKERS, who we'll look at in a future lecture, to be inspired to achieve liberation so that we don't have to go through this anymore. So that concludes our first lecture. I hope it's been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.